I'm going to compare the JAKOTA triangle. So you compare Japan with North Korea and South Korea in terms of their demographic indicators on the left, but also their population pyramids. In the case of Japan, we see actually a negative growth rate. So here we have one country in the world in which it's actually getting smaller and smaller in terms of the number of people that live there. Reasons for that. First off, we look at the total fertility rate. It's below 2.1. Once again, 2.1 is the replacement rate. So anything below 2.1 means we're going to see fewer and fewer fertility, and so fewer and fewer babies being born, but also subsequently the population should slow down, all things being equal. We also see when we compare crude birth rate to crude death rate that in 2016, the crude birth rate was 8, the crude death rate was 10. That means more people are dying than are being born. So here we have another example of an odd country, not odd, but just different compared to every other country we discussed, where it actually has more people dying, a higher death rate than birth rate. Further, we look at the bottom. We look at net migration rate. Here we see historically those negatives. So negative 50,000 number of migrants in 95, negative 52,000 there in 2005. And we don't really see a lot of in-migration to Japan. So what's going on there is Japan's had a very strict policy regarding migration. This is going to be much different when we compare a different country in this little packet of case studies. We actually see a place in which they're actually encouraging migration. Now things are starting to change in Japan. Policy is starting to open up, and that's why we see a zero. It's not a negative zero anymore. It's actually a zero. And so what's happening there is we see a young population kind of missing on that population pyramid on the right-hand side. So they're finding the need to find workers, particularly young workers. They're getting those workers from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from China. They're getting those workers from nearby that are satisfying kind of that shortage in labor from an overwhelmingly young population. But nonetheless, the data clearly indicates that we have a stage 4 country. Very slow growth, if at all. Very much a birth rate and death rate that are close to the same. Also, we see a very high life expectancy. In fact, this is going to be one of the highest life expectancies we'll ever find. Also, very, very, very low infant mortality rate, which are all indicators we got a very wealthy, very much got their act together economy, which we see also in demography. Now, looking over at the population pyramid, we can see some trends. First off, we look at some sex ratio imbalances. Now, we don't really see much of a sex ratio imbalance until we get above the age of 60, especially when we get to 65 and above, 70 and above. That's when you really notice there's more women than men. What's going on there? Conflict, for sure. We think about World War II. Obviously, men were more engaged in conflict than women. But don't say that, there's definitely a lot of Japanese women who lost their lives during World War II. But definitely men, we can see that sex ratio imbalance. But now if we look at, just age characteristics, first off, yeah, there aren't that many people over the age of 70 compared to the rest of the pyramid. But compared to other countries, that's a lot of old people. So in Japan, there is a very large old population. So that's how, they're going to see a much different, characteristics as far as, marketing. You're going to see stair lifts being marketed. You're going to see, different types of foods, different types of medicines. That are being marketed there compared to another country where it might have a much younger population. We come back down a little farther from the top of the population pyramid. We can see the biggest group there, that group that's in the age 65 to 69. What's going on there is a typical pattern. When we think about what happened, what ended about 70 years ago, World War II. So we typically have a post-war boom. Sometimes in other places of the world, post-independence boom, and we see that here. Now you go down a little farther, you see the 40 to 44 age group, which also another bulge. That's essentially what we call an echo boom. Very common in developed countries when they have that post-war boom. You'll see in about 20 years, 30 years, an echo boom of just that boom having their children. But for the most part, we can see from World War II on, the population pyramid kind of comes inward at the base, clearly indicative of a stage 4 country. Stage 4 countries have an inward shaped base. So here in Japan, quintessential stage 4 country in which you're actually seeing a decline in population, but now they're starting to change their tune on their migration policy as they want to open themselves up and fill the void of those 20 to 30-year-olds that are missing because there's just lower fertility rates and just more development. And also through the fact that we're very urban here in Japan. All these reasons helps explain why fertility rates and birth rates are quite low. Here in North Korea, we also see a lowering fertility rate, a lowering birth rate, a lowering growth rate, but this is an anomaly. This is one of those countries they're so weird and different. Now that's not culturally, it's just so they're just odd in terms of them being an isolationist. They are really not part of the global economy. You don't see large migration in and out of North Korea. So politically, culturally, economically, they're isolated. And so they kind of have some patterns that aren't typical. So we see birth rate higher than death rate. So that right there explains why we see a little bit of a growth here. So you also see a little bit of an increase in life expectancy. Notice compared to Japan, much lower in terms of life expectancy, and nearly almost 20 years lower. And that's once again related to income. That's related to health. That's just overall infrastructure, which is lacking in North Korea, especially healthcare. Also, what's going on? You do see kind of that slow growth that's kind of being offset, and so even slow down even more by out-migration. Now, not a lot of out-migration, but we see a little bit of an out-migration. And once again, we're going to come back and talk about migration later, but we don't see a lot of people moving in and out. Now looking at the population pyramid. We see at the top, we can see examples of conflict. Once again, the missing males at the top. And if we go, okay, well, what ended about 54, 55 years ago? About the Korean War, the Korean conflict. And so here, once again, we can use these population pyramids to understand things that happened in the past. So you can see evidence of a conflict with the post-conflict boom in the population, but also the sex ratio imbalance of so many more men before that boom that are missing because they probably died in conflict. But from that, we see also, similar to Japan, another echo boom. We see the 45 to 49-year-olds that had their echo boom. So there's a lot of 15, 20 to 25-year-olds currently in North Korea. But we look at the base of the population pyramid. It has the illusion, the false illusion that it's a stage 3 country. It's got that rectangular base, maybe even coming inward. But once again, this is just because it's such a backwards country. It's so rural, so impoverished, that there's not a lot going on here. Finally, we have South Korea, which has very slow growth, evident in that, look at the crude birth rate compared to the crude death rate, 8 to 6, and so barely growing naturally. But if we look at the growth rate, kind of an interesting pattern here in which it went from 0.2 in 2005 to 0.6 in 2015. So what's going on there is a change in policy. So we think about growth rate. What does it include? Growth rate includes migration. Natural increase, rate of natural increase, that doesn't include growth rate. So we look at the bottom, whoa, we see a change. You look at the net number of migrants or the net migration rate from 2005 to 2015, a major change. So here we see the opposite of what we saw in Japan, where there's a strict immigration policy. Here, there's actually now an encouraging of migration. So the encouragement of migration has actually led to a large in-migration, which has caused not only the growth rate to go up, but if you look at the fertility rate as well. And so because often these are young migrants coming from nearby countries, but also other countries in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, and other parts of Asia are moving here because the government and the policy, they're just bending over backwards trying to get people to move there. And so people are subsequently doing that because there's jobs there. It's an industry. It's industrialization. They make cars. They make TVs. They manufacture all kinds of things. And so there's this demand for laborers, and so it's being satisfied by this in-migration. So we see, in the case of South Korea, how the fertility rate's actually gone up because young people are migrating and then subsequently having their children there. Now, it's still below replacement level. It's still well below the 2.1, but nonetheless, that helps to explain why we actually see an increase in, although, very, very slow increase in the population here in South Korea. So individuals and policymakers can play a role in demography. So look at the population pyramid on the right-hand side. Similar to North Korea, we do see post-Korean conflict boom. We see the fewer males, likely related to conflict. But in the case of South Korea, there are, a good amount of elderly that live a longer life because they have higher levels of development, higher levels of wealth, better health care. So we compare South Korea versus North Korea, major differences. So they might be on the same peninsula, they might be come from the same ethnicity and the same cultural backgrounds. They are much different in so many ways, economically, demographically, and so on. Further, we look at this population pyramid pretty much from that post-Korean conflict boom. We see all the way farther down, it becomes more of an inward shape, which is quintessential stage 4 country. So South Korea, they've got their act together. They are actually now encouraging migration, and it makes sense that people are going to be moving from stage 2, stage 3 countries to a nearby stage 4 country that has jobs, but also has demand for certain industries and certain workers because of an increasingly aging population. You got a lot of people in their 50s, they're going to soon be retiring. You need to fill that shortage of labor, and they're doing so with migration.